Hey everybody, I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, and I'm excited about the residency. So, what I want to share with you today is a kind of meditation on a feeling or an intuition or a sensibility that either is sort of going on in the background as I write and I'm not entirely aware of it, or I'm aware of it and I'm trying to get there but I don't know how. And so it's a kind of meditation on all those aspects of creative writing that we can't really teach and that we don't often describe, and this is me thinking about that and trying to describe it to make it somehow useful. When I'm writing, I often have no idea what I'm doing. Most of the time, I don't have any idea what I'm doing, and I think I said earlier today that I'm always trying to get to the things that are on my mind that I had no idea were on my mind, in hopes that my mind is similar to a lot of other minds. So this is called Writing the Unfathomable. Some notes on the poetic sublime. It's in 13 parts if you want to follow along. Some of them are very short. 1. Okay, I'll be the first to admit that I only sort of know what writing the unfathomable means. Also, I don't think that writing the unfathomable is possible, at least not in any straightforward, logical way, since to do so would involve a sort of transfiguration of language into shadow, spirit, ghost, snow, etc. i.e., it would involve turning language into the world, the vast and the void, ecstasy and sorrow, actual human spirit, which is impossible. And yet, I persist, or rather, I desire to write the things, ethereal as they may ultimately be, that are on my mind, that I have no idea are on my mind, and also which I somehow feel to be deeper than I ever am or can be consciously. Consciously, I am not deep. I am all surfaces, which are largely definable, material, containable, measurable, and writable. That is, consciously, I am not transcendent, unsayable, unfathomable, beyond. Still, in spite of these limitations, one of the things, especially creative writing, often is a conduit to the beyond, an imperfect glimpse into that shape in the periphery, that sense that there's more to life than that which we can apprehend with our 5 senses and science and logic. I'm talking here about the scaffolding of being and meaning itself, our connection to the all-caps big picture of what it means to be alive. Unfathomable writing is writing which attempts to map that bigger picture to connect us as stars in a vast constellation. 2. Fathom. A unit of length equal to 6 feet, used chiefly in nautical measurements, to measure the depth of by means of a sounding line, sound, to penetrate to the truth of, comprehend, understand. Our word fathom, in its noun form, if you've never had the occasion to think about it, indicates a unit of length equal to 6 feet, used especially for measuring the depth of water. Etymologically speaking, it comes to us from an Old English word, phaeon, which meant the length of the outstretched arms, but also an embrace, and figuratively speaking, it meant power. Additionally, it's related to Proto-Germanic, Old Norse, and Saxon words which mean bosom and thread. The verb form of the word to fathom means to measure the depth by means of a sounding line. And isn't that exactly, at least metaphorically, what poems do? Measure the depths by means of a sounding line. Figuratively speaking, fathom means to penetrate the truth of, comprehend or understand. In some of the etymology previously mentioned, the word also means to grasp, which we do with our hands and our minds alike. Very generally then, our word fathom is related to measurement and containment, reaching and understanding. When we fathom something, we're able to map it comprehensively or wrap our arms or minds around it, hold it close. To fathom is a matter of being able to traverse the verse and traverse the depths, to get to the deepest point, to know there's a bottom, an end, an object with an understandable shape, or puzzle with an understandable solution. It's a practical activity that allows us to grasp and make clear sense of experience and objects that may initially seem too murky, too deep, or too vast to articulate clearly. With this in mind, let us now unfathom the fathom. 3. To describe something as unfathomable is to designate it as immeasurable, infinitely deep, infinitely charged, impossibly overwhelming in size, shape, character, or charm. But it also means something incapable of being fully explored or understood. Thus, whatever we deem unfathomable is also rationally uncontainable, insensible, a thing, not a thing. Impossible to wrap our arms and heads around. Synonyms include inscrutable, incomprehensible, enigmatic, indecipherable, impenetrable, obscure, esoteric, mysterious, mystifying, deep, and profound. At the climax of his epic poem, The Prelude, and I'm talking about the 1805 version, William Wordsworth's speaker, Wordsworth, has ascended in the dark of the night the highest peak in Wales, Mount Snowdon, and he is so overtaken by the scene, he calls it a breathtaking scene, a sea of mist, a burning moon, a blue chasm, and in the near distance, the roar of water. He almost can't stand it. He is overcome or annihilated, as Keats might have put it. He's overcome by the extent and grandeur of the natural world. To write about the experience as he recollects it later in tranquility, he turns inward, searches himself, activates the impossibility of the moment remembered with poetry, with words. What follows is one of the most compelling reports on the unfathomable that I think I've ever read. This is from the Prelude. It's on your handout. A meditation rose in me that night upon the lonely mountain when the scene had passed away. And it appeared to me the perfect image of a mighty mind, of one that feeds upon infinity, that is exalted by an underpresence, the sense of God, or whatsoever is dim or vast in its own being. In other words, Wordsworth on that mountaintop claims to see, as he says, it appeared to me, which makes it sound almost apparitional, a mighty mind of one that feeds upon infinity, that is exalted by an underpresence, which he equates with the sense of God. In more contemporary, less exalted terms, we might say, Wordsworth describes here an existential experience, one that makes him cognizant of his own limitations in relation to the vast of what is, and it brings about in him a kind of astonishment in the face of the fact that anything exists at all, which is a version of religious feeling, a religious experience. I find this passage to be both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Comforting in its suggestion of the existence of something rather than nothing, which connects and supports what it is to be fully awake, alive, a vast underpresence of substance beneath the surfaces of things. But at the same time, it's terrifying in the sense that the underpresence feeds on infinity, is powered, nourished by everything, including presence itself. Imagine, if you will, its power in relation to we who are finite and small. There is a ravenousness at work in the way Wordsworth describes his experience, a ravenousness which consumes us all. The mighty mind, Wordsworth describes, is the significant other. And he and we cannot help but be in awe before it. What's wild and practical both here is that he uses figurative language, fashions a word, underpresence, and makes a comparison, goes vast, goes God. He can't describe it and do justice to it directly, so he has to talk not about it, but about what it evokes, what it points to. An unseen foundation. This is some of what I want to get to in my writing. The underpresence below the surface, which is ordinarily invisible and yet is the skeleton, the nerves, the veins, and the blood of being. To write the unfathomable, then, has something to do with finding a short circuit via language to the human spirit itself, the meaningfulness beneath the surface, the wonder that anything exists at all, a wonder which we sometimes feel but can't fully articulate. To become conscious of it requires a particular kind of attention. X-ray vision, a desire to move beyond the appearances of things, to transcend the ordinary, to sublimate the body and attempt to say what can't be said. Everything sayable implies what isn't, and there's a sense in which the meaningfulness of the former depends on the latter, the ghost in reality's machine. 4. If this is all too transcendent or spiritual, then perhaps something more scientific will help. According to NASA.gov, many contemporary physicists are convinced that 68% of the universe is made up of dark energy and another 27% is dark matter, neither of which can be seen nor investigated or articulated in any clear, well-lit way because, well, they're dark. And yet, their effects, these scientists say, are everywhere present in the expansion of the universe, in the spaces between the light. And furthermore, it's this darkness that sort of binds all that's light together. No. If 68% of the universe is dark energy and 27% is dark matter, then that means the remaining 5 or so percent is everything ever observed with all our various instruments. People, mountains, oceans, skyscrapers, roller coasters, wildebeest, glaciers, flowers, vanilla ice cream, and sea. In other words, the perceivable, mappable, rationally understandable world is only a tiny little fraction of what is. All the stuff in the broad daylight and dark of night, and yet there seems to be more. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge put it, I am convinced there are many more invisible things in the world than visible ones. For instance, 5. Scientists have now discovered a black hole 21 billion times the mass of our sun. Fathom that. 6. There's the second half of 6. 7. Thinking about the unfathomable and analogs that point to or elucidated in our experience got me thinking about the sublime. What's the sublime? Well, it's been formulated lots of different ways over time, but generally speaking, it involves an experience of forces or objects in nature or in art, depicting, evoking, or demonstrating such forces, which provoke in us simultaneous aesthetic feelings of pleasure and terror, shock and awe, wonder and dread. The 18th century English-Irish aesthetician and statesman Edmund Burke defined the sublime in terms of astonishment brought about by a mixture of terror and obscurity. Quote, that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. As an aesthetic value, the sublime is often contrasted with beauty, which for most philosophers is more properly attached to works of art rather than natural phenomena, provoking in us aesthetic pleasure or imaginative desire. Beauty doesn't terrify, it glorifies purely. Beauty is a thing to have and to hold. The sublime, in contrast, is overwhelming to the point that it's as scary as it is glorious. Think of a tornado or a storm at sea. Think of standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. The sublime cannot be held. The sublime holds us, enthralled and maybe afraid. For the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, beauty was a matter of quality, exciting the imagination, whereas the sublime is a matter of quantity, in defiance of reason. The contemporary American philosopher Crispin Sartwell, in his book The 6 Names of Beauty, articulates the difference this way. Whereas the beautiful conveys to us its fragility, the sublime conveys to us our own. As such, the sublime is the activation by nature or art of what might be described as a version of religious feeling, of spirit that brings us in contact with extreme, gargantuan, all-encompassing grandeur and terror in a way that fixes us, in all senses, where we stand and gape and gawk and whir. It is the overwhelming consciousness of now hammering our hearts with wonder and awfulness. As David Dye, the author of The American Technological Sublime, puts it, the sublime is an essentially religious feeling aroused by the confrontation with impressive objects. But what's interesting is that here in 2020, a lot of the impressive objects we encounter, both in our daily lives and conceptually, aren't objects at all, e.g. the internet, terrorism, globalization. There's also climate change, which is an ongoing non-event event. It's happening for real, but it's a shadow of our consumption. What we consume disappears, but not its effects. It's magic, but not. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The earth is getting warmer. Our existence comes back to haunt us. 8. Here's how the contemporary poet Mary Ruefle describes the sublime. This is on your handout. The sublime. Had no warning of what to expect. No sign of sharp curves. Hadn't gone far when I came to hairpin turns every few hundred feet. On both sides of me, deep canyons with only a few scrimpy bushes between me and the abyss. My hair stood on end. The road was narrower than narrower, turning this way and that as I climbed, hunched over the steering wheel. Could see from the corner of my eye that there was an incredible view, but couldn't look. The sublime, as Ruefle notes here, is the presentation of an encounter with the abyss, but also it's an incredible view that terrifies and compels us while simultaneously defying us to take it all in. It's too much. We can't look, and yet we want to gape upon it. It is a thrill of life to face down death / our own annihilation. The sublime is a vital sign, reminding us of our own vitality and our own mortality and our own fragility. And because it's overwhelming beyond reason, dangerous and unpredictable, it's also at the same time immeasurably beautiful. As the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy notes, the subject of the sublime, if there is one, is a subject who is moved. And yet, such subjects are moved to a stillness, scared and revelated to death in life. 9. Friends, it is difficult to talk about poetry, which is why we're always talking about something else. It's a quote from Dean Young. There's a long section here where I talk about John Clare's Lines I Am, which I'm not going to do now, but it's on your handout. In the interest of time. 10. The Sublime is Now by Barnett Newman. In doing research for this talk, I stumbled on an essay from 1948 by the abstract expressionist painter Barnett Newman called The Sublime is Now, which led me in turn to a 1988 essay by the French postmodern theorist Jean-Francois Lyotard titled The Sublime and the Avant-Garde. And without getting too wound up in either of them, they're important in the present context in the way they emphasize the sublime as a manifestation in consciousness of the ungraspable, unrepresentable, unwritable present of the present. I swear this is all going to come together in the end. Or maybe it won't. For his part, Newman was trying to understand how to make sense of religious, sublime feeling experience and how to make sublime works of art in a cultural milieu that, by and large, rejects traditional notions of God. The question, he wrote, is how, if we are living in a time without a legend or mythos that can be called sublime, if we refuse to admit any exaltation in pure relations, if we refuse to live in abstraction, how can we be creating a sublime art? And his answer is, instead of making cathedrals out of Christ, man, or life, we are making them out of ourselves, out of our own feelings. The image we produce is a self-evident one of revelation, real and concrete, that can be understood by anyone who will look at it without the nostalgic glasses of history. Or, as I'd like to add, the futuristic glasses of desire, need, or dread. In other words, as the essay's title suggests, the sublime is an expression of and revelation about being itself, which is embodied in right now. And if the sublime is linked to the unfathomable, as I'm suggesting it is, then writing the unfathomable is writing that addresses the invisible tangle of being itself right now. Of course, this is a pretty difficult order, since the present is always a shimmering, fluctuating, and weirdly incomprehensible bridge between the past and the future. The past has already happened, so it's relatively easy to wrap our brains around. The future is the depository and rhinoceros charging toward us of both desire and dread, but it too is a thing we understand because we plan for it. The present, on the other hand, now, is an enigma blossoming out of what has been and slipping almost immediately into the future. For Newman, the sublime of the 20th century was to be found in an awakening of consciousness to the presence of the present. Jean-Francois Lyotard picks up Newman's now directly in his essay, The Sublime and the Avant-Garde, noting that, quote, Newman's now, which is no more than now, is a stranger to consciousness and cannot be constituted by it. Rather, it is what dismantles consciousness. It is what consciousness cannot formulate, and even what consciousness forgets in order to constitute itself. The sublime now is, in Lyotard's words, the question mark itself. The consciousness that nothing might happen. The nothingness now, which is annihilation. The possibility of freedom from time, space, and the possibility of the end, both simultaneously. For both Newman and Lyotard, the main point is that the sublime, whether in nature or in art, presents us with the fact that there is something unpresentable. The essence of now begging the question, does it happen? And by it, one means the scaffolding of the unfolding of consciousness. But where in language can we identify this now, this big sublime now? How can we represent the unpresentable? Or is it something we already do and could pay attention to more? 11. Keeping now in mind isn't easy, as to do so requires keeping tracking something which is seemingly always fleeting. The time traveler poet's dilemma isn't in getting to the past or the future, but rather in getting to the present and staying present. Part of the problem is that to focus on the now, to be cognizant of it and live in it in the way I'm thinking here, isn't a matter of doing something. It's about becoming conscious of the scaffolding of possibility, the connective tissue that makes meaning, understanding, and human connection possible. Nowness requires, if not a suspension of all activity, at the very least a recognition that the concrete particulars of our lives don't happen in a vacuum, and thus we focus our attention on the context itself, the binding and glue, the nature, the human spirit that makes us all more similar than we are different, and which via empathy is the basis of the celebration of difference. How can we then find our way to this in writing, which is not a frozen now, but an activity? Where is Newman's sublime now in language? One of the places I think we might find it are in poems which seek to document or catalog or annotate the movement of the human mind as it happens, moment to moment. And I also, by the way, think that you could also find it in fiction, like the works of someone like David Markson, a book like This Is Not a Novel. I'm thinking of the Zen poetics of Philip Whalen, Gary Snyder, but also the very associative, disjunctive, and formally experimental poetics of John Ashbery or Lynn Heginian. Often such poems present us with a sort of panoramic vision of a mind in motion. But as objects, such poems are always a kind of stillness as well, a confrontation with motion suspended. One contemporary poet whose work manifests this sublime sense of now in terms of a kind of radical present is Hua Wen. Her poems combine an almost Zen sense of attention to consciousness itself as a thing that unfolds, blossoms, at the same time that they suspend its motion via poetic activity in a way that highlights the material object-making power of words. Put another way, her work always points back not only to a bigger picture, but to bigger pictures, revealing the now kaleidoscopically. Her poem, We Are Free to Eat, is maybe a typical example, and it's on your handout. We are free to eat. We are free to eat and love. We spray on poison. Ants bite me. I am riding towards the things in 3 rule. If you were in my poem, driving a purple pickup with a blinker on, play the music loud. Make out music, fuck me music, the Al Green song I like to strip to. The ground is cracked from lack of rain. We're in the shade, writing. There are rose thorns and the huge legume family. I'm on the verge of swimming. The sky is a time arch with feeling. Various shreds on the ground. Red foil, old gray mulch, dried bee belly. Hopefully, the present tense aspect of this poem is clear right away. The poem itself is itself a largely declarative catalog of the now. We are free. We spray on poison. Ants bite. I am writing, etc. Stanza 2 begins with the conditional if, but it's sort of a trick since it's not a matter of if the you is in the poem driving a purple pickup, but that he or she is in the poem via Wen's writing it into the poem this instant. And this is followed by 2 imperatives, play and make, both of which call for action now. Stanza 3 returns to the present where we stay for the rest of the poem, including in the final list of various shreds on the ground. Red foil, old gray mulch, dried bee belly. That final list is a sculpture. The kind of sculpture that's everywhere available if only we take the time to look. If only we take the time to list it, which is a kind of assembly of being, an installation of consciousness written. The poem allows us to see and experience what Wen's speaker sees and experiences as it happens. She is writing it down. The now is thus preserved radically. That is, it is made into an object as the poem. These things don't all happen at once, but the poem creates a simultaneity, freezes the movement of consciousness in a way that codifies the span of several moments in a single object. Not consciousness explained, consciousness on display. What's important here isn't what's recorded, but that recording is occurring, that there is in fact something to record, and that apparatus is available to everyone. Notice, too, that in addition to writing, which is mentioned twice in the poem, there are 3 other gerunds, driving, swimming, and feeling, as words that turn action itself to write, to drive, to swim, to feel, into objects, writing, driving, swimming, and feeling. Perhaps the gerund is one of the chief means that a writer has of pointing to the sublime sense of now, that it happens, in the way that it reformulates action as an object, suspended in time that never ceases, and thus reminds us of the fullness of the present. Gerunds preserve, but also kill. Now doesn't merely bridge the past and the future, it contains them. This freaks me out a little bit. Now is maybe the most unfathomable thing, not a thing there is. 12. I want to start with this long excerpt from A.R. Emmons' poem Garbage. It's on your handout. If you'll bear with me, I want to go ahead and read it. Oh, good, okay. I'm terrified, by the way. So thank you for being nice. Okay, From Garbage, Part 7. So I punched in garbage disposal, and then the screen came blank. Nothing. All those titles, row on row of Western goodies, mostly worse than junk, but not a word on disposal. I should have looked, I suppose, under waste disposal, but who cares? I already got the point. I know garbage is being disposed of, but what I wanted, I had gotten. A clear space and pure freedom to dump whatever. And this means most of the catalog must go. So much that what is left will need no computer to be kept track of. Har. Words are a specialization on sound-making kind of language. But there are many, not just languages, but kinds of language. The Blue Jay's extensive vocabulary signals states of feeling or being, alarm, exasperation, feeding, idleness. And the signal systems lay out the states for the safety of sharing by others, alerting to danger, even sharing food sources. Whales' pod songs keep intimate transactions fluid. Horses neigh, whinny, and snuffle. Coach. Elephants network even distant air with sound waves too low for us to hear. Oh no, we are not alone in language. We may be alone in words, at least almost alone in speaking them, not alone, Coco, in understanding them. At least reacting to them, we are nearly alone in words, but the words do for us what other languages do for others. They warn, inform, reassure, compare, present. We may be alone in words, but we are not singular in language. Have some respect for other speakers of being, and for God's sake, drop all this crap about words, singularity, and dominion. It is so boring when I hear it. A hook of anger in my guts tears the lining. The world was the beginning of the world. Words are a way of fitting in the world. Whole languages, like species, can disappear without dropping a gram of Earth's weight. And symbolic systems to a fare you well can be added without filling a ditch or thimble. Our cousins, the birds, talk in the morning. I can tell the weather by their voices before I open my eyes. I know some of their words because I share with them their states of being and feeling. My cousins, the robins, tug worms up from the lawn and eat them, and that gives me a piece of conflictual reality until I savor the hog in my bacon, admire the thigh bone in my chicken. When the hens used to sing in the spring, laying into their ladders, the windy courtship time of mating and nesting, I can hear the singing now, the good times. I know the entire language of chickens, from rooster crows to bitty cheeps. It is a language sufficient to the forms and procedures nature assigned to chicken birds, but a language, as competition goes, not sufficient to protect them from us. Our systems now change their genes, their forms and procedures, house them up in all life houses, trick their egg laying with artificial days and nights. Our language is something to write home about, but it is not the world. Grooming does for baboons most of what words do for us. Damn. Makes me want to cry. In his National Book Award-winning contemporary epic, Garbage, A.R. Ammons meditates on human consumption and waste, philosophically unpacking as he goes the variety of ways we make and unmake, consume and dispose of the world as we find it. The poem ebbs and flows between mindful daily observation, description, and revelatory epiphany. In so doing, it forces a kind of confrontation with something most of us would rather not think about: the garbage we produce and write and speak, and the dust we become. In section 7 of the poem, Ammons' speaker is at the library looking up garbage disposal in the digital card catalog and is at first surprised when he finds not a word, as if all had been previously cleared away. And this leads him rather associatively to declare that most of the catalog must go, that most of the texts in the library are kind of a waste of breath, insufficient in what they say and what they don't. Continuing in this associative way, Ammons begins talking about language itself, making a really vital distinction between language and words. For him, it seems the latter, words, are a way of fending in the world, while the former is an expression of being, whether spoken by human beings or blue jays or whales or chickens. We may be alone in words, but we are not singular in language. Have some respect for other speakers of being. The implication here is that words are one incomplete piece of the puzzle of language, which is a much larger, more vital category of the ways being is expressed in the world. So many words are wasted on the very practical aspects of being alive. And at the same time, we are distracted in a variety of ways from the bigger picture. Language, the expression of being in the moment, the wonder of that, the astonishment, the awe of now. As creative writers, we are in the business of using words in the impossible pursuit of language itself. And we do this in ways that are familiar to all of us. We activate the associative, etymological, figurative possibilities of words to find their sublime shadows, and imagination is the only limit, which is no limit, only a vast, raging sea of what might be. Put another way, the creative writer's job, and of course I'm talking about me, is to move from the beauty of words to the unfathomable sublime of language, which, that's what I got to. After all that, probably could have just said that.
It wouldn't have been as fun.
I feel like we could have, it's like supposedly at his thesis defense, the philosopher Wittgenstein sat down with his two interlocutors, Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, and they sat down and they were going to quiz him about his thesis. And Wittgenstein said, "Gentlemen, is this really necessary? Let's go have a beer." So I feel like I could have saved you all a bunch of trouble. Put another way, the creative writer's job is to move from the beauty of words to the unfathomable sublime of language. 13. There's nothing left to say here except what can't be said. So we should all go out and attempt to say it, attempt to write it while remaining unconscious or conscious. You decide of the fact that an attempt is all it is. We fail to contain the world's worth, and this failure is our joy, prolongs our desire, demonstrates our finitude. It makes me feel grateful that feelings like astonishment are with me. The mystery is with me. That poetry is an art of resistance to our limits in love. As Apollinaire put it, "Forgive me my ignorance. Forgive me for no longer knowing the old game of rhyming. I know nothing anymore and I can only love." Thank you.